Prior to World War II, the Australian government relied on Britain for its defence. Australia's defence policy rested upon the Singapore strategy. If Australia faced a serious threat, Britain's naval and military forces in Singapore would protect Australia. Then, in 1942, Singapore fell. The collapse of Britain's supposedly impregnable Asian fortress shattered the foundations of Australian strategic thinking. The country suddenly faced an uncomfortable question that would dominate the defence policy throughout the early Cold War. Who would now be responsible for Australia's security? Many historians and commentators have offered a simple answer. After the fall of Singapore, Australia shifted its allegiance from Britain to the United States. The security treaty between Australia, New Zealand and the United States, known as ANZUS, was signed in 1951. Australian forces fought alongside the United States in Korea. The story appears straightforward, but is this what really happened? How independent was Australia's defence policy during the early Cold War? And if Australia had become more independent from Britain, just how dependent had it become upon the United States? The fall of Singapore left Australia with a strategic dilemma. Britain had demonstrated that it could no longer guarantee Australian security. Yet the United States was not prepared to immediately replace Britain as Australia's protector. In the years immediately following the war, Washington rapidly reduced its military commitments. The United States emerged from the Second World War as the world's most powerful military force, but American leaders were eager to demobilize. Millions of servicemen were returned home. Wartime military spending was slashed. Bases established across the Pacific were closed or reduced, and policymakers sought to avoid new security obligations that might tie the United States to distant conflicts. This retrenchment was particularly evident in Asia. Although the United States retained a presence in Japan and the Philippines, it showed little interest in assuming responsibility for the wider defense of Southeast Asia. American policymakers expected the colonial powers, Britain in Malaya and Singapore, France in Indochina, and the Netherlands in the Dutch East Indies, to resume responsibility for regional security. For Australian leaders, this was deeply concerning. The war had demonstrated that threats to Australia could emerge through Southeast Asia, yet the one power capable of replacing Britain appeared unwilling to commit itself to the region. Australia quickly discovered that the United States had little interest in providing a formal security guarantee. As a result, Australia found itself in an awkward position. Britain appeared weaker than before. America remained reluctant. There was no obvious alternative to continued cooperation with Britain and the Commonwealth. How Australia responded to this situation was the central question for Australia in the early stages of the Cold War. In 1947, Australia's Chiefs of Staff prepared a memorandum titled Appreciation of the Strategical Position of Australia. The document identified the Philippines and the Malaya Peninsula as the key approaches through which an enemy might threaten Australia. The significance of this assessment might be overlooked. Australian planners were now defining strategic priorities according to Australia's geography rather than that of Britain's. Australia's Labor Prime Minister Ben Chifley was reluctant to adopt Britain's threat assessments as Australia's own. Britain and Australia were the closest allies, yet Australia was already questioning whether Britain's priorities reflected Australia's interests. The issue became particularly apparent in relation to Malaya. Britain viewed Malaya primarily through an imperial lens. Its rubber and tin exports were economically vital to the British economy. This was not the case for Australia. To Australian planners, Malaya's importance lay in its strategic position along the approaches to Australia. The same territory, but two different reasons for defending it. The difference became even clearer in 1948. Britain requested Australian support for Hong Kong as communist forces advanced in China. The Australian government refused. This refusal was significant because Hong Kong occupied an important place in Britain's strategic thinking. London hoped that Commonwealth support would demonstrate resolve and help preserve Britain's empire in East Asia. Australian leaders, however, saw little strategic value in committing scarce military resources to a vulnerable colony adjacent to the Chinese mainland. They doubted that Hong Kong could be defended in the event of a major conflict and believed that any forces sent there would be exposed without materially improving Australia's security. The decision reflected a broader shift in Australian strategic thinking. Rather than automatically supporting British imperial commitments, the Australian government asked whether a deployment directly contributed to Australia's own defence. Britain also sought greater Australian commitments in Malaya. Canberra remained cautious. Although Australian policymakers regarded Malaya as strategically important, they were unwilling to simply accept British requests without considering the scale and purpose of any commitment. Australian leaders wanted to ensure that resources were directed towards the defence of Southeast Asia as a whole, rather than merely preserving British colonial interests. Britain wanted support for Middle Eastern defence. For Britain, the Middle East remained a central theatre because of its imperial communications, oil supplies, and global strategic position. Australia viewed the region differently. Australian leaders recognised its importance to Britain, but did not see it as vital to Australia's own security. Threats emerging through Southeast Asia were more immediate. With limited military resources available, the Australian government was reluctant to commit forces to a region that lay outside what was increasingly regarded as Australia's primary strategic area. Taken together, these disagreements reveal an important pattern. Australia was not rejecting cooperation with Britain, nor was it abandoning the Commonwealth, but it was increasingly willing to distinguish between British interests and Australian interests. You would think the arrival of the Menzies Conservative Liberal government in 1949 would mean the return to traditional ways. Menzies was deeply attached to Britain. His government presented as especially embracing cooperation with Britain and adopted a strong anti-communist outlook, which he used to attack the Australian Labor Party. Many assumed this would lead Australia back towards a more traditional imperial defence policy. However, this was not the case. The Menzies government embraced the forward defence concept, the belief that Australia would be safer if potential threats were contained well to the north of the continent rather than waiting for them to approach Australian shores. This perspective did not align with British priorities, which remained heavily committed to global responsibilities rather than just those in Southeast Asia. The practical consequence soon became apparent. Australia committed forces to the Malayan emergency and became a key contributor to the Commonwealth Strategic Reserve, established in Malaya in 1955. The Commonwealth Strategic Reserve was a permanent force of British, Australian and New Zealand troops, aircraft and warship based in Malaya. The reserve was intended to deter communist aggression and provide a ready force for the defence of Southeast Asia. Australia justified its participation not simply as support for Britain's imperial interests, but as a means of defending its own strategic frontier. Canberra also sought to influence British strategy itself. Australian leaders argued to the British that Malaya was the key position in Southeast Asia and that its defence should remain a priority over potential conflicts in the Middle East or East Asia. Far from simply following British strategy, Australia was attempting to reshape it. Menzies remained culturally and politically attached to Britain, but attachment did not mean obedience. On the most important strategic question facing Australia, where the country's security perimeter should be drawn, his government, continuing the work of the Chifley government, pursued priorities that reflected Australian rather than British interests. If Australia was more independent from Britain, perhaps it simply became dependent upon the United States. Australia certainly looked to Washington for support, but did it receive it? The evidence from the late 1940s and early 1950s suggests a more complicated relationship than a simple transfer of dependence. Even before ANZUS, Australian governments were actively seeking ways to secure a stronger American presence in the Pacific. One of the earliest examples came in 1946, when the Chifley government attempted to secure continuing American commitment by offering access to the wartime base at Manus Island. The proposal reflected Australian hopes that strategic cooperation might encourage a lasting American presence in the Southwest Pacific. Manus Island, located in the Admiralty Islands north of New Guinea, had been transformed during the Second World War into one of the largest Allied naval bases in the Pacific. Its deep-water harbour had supported major American naval operations against Japan and was viewed by Australian planners as a potentially valuable asset in any future conflict. The Australian government believed that an ongoing American presence on Manus Island could create a strong strategic connection between Australian and American security interests, because it would become more difficult for Washington to disengage from the Southwest Pacific. The Australian government was trying to encourage an American commitment without yet having a formal alliance. The effort failed. Washington preferred to walk away from the base rather than accept new obligations. American policymakers saw little need to maintain expensive facilities in the region during a period of rapid demobilisation and were wary of any arrangement that might imply responsibility for Australia's defence. The Manus episode exposed the limits of Australian influence at a very early stage of the Cold War and how reluctant the US was to become Australia's security guarantor. If Canberra wanted a closer relationship with Washington, it would need to demonstrate its value as an ally and find new ways to align Australia's interests with American strategic priorities. Australian policymakers therefore spent much of the late 1940s searching for opportunities to convince the United States that Australian security and American security were closely connected. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 appeared to provide exactly such an opportunity. Australia quickly committed naval, air, and later ground forces to the United Nations effort led by the United States. This decision was motivated by genuine concern about communist expansion in Asia, but it also reflected a broader diplomatic calculation. Australian leaders hoped that demonstrating loyalty to the United States would strengthen Australia's case for a formal security guarantee. Menzies' External Affairs Minister, Percy Spender, was particularly determined to secure such an arrangement. He believed that Australia's long-term security required a direct American commitment and worked tirelessly to convince Washington that Australia was a reliable ally whose interests aligned with those of the United States in the Pacific. Spender's efforts were assisted by changing international circumstances. The communist victory in China in 1949, the outbreak of the Korean War, and growing American concern about security in Asia made Washington more receptive than it had been immediately after the Second World War. These developments contributed to the signing of the ANZUS Treaty in 1951. At first glance, ANZUS appears to support the argument that Australia simply transferred its dependence from Britain to America. However, Australian policymakers were not entirely satisfied with the result. Could it really be said to be full dependence? They had hoped for something much stronger. Australian officials wanted an arrangement resembling NATO, complete with clear obligations, integrated military planning, and institutional mechanisms that would bind the United States to the defense of the Pacific. Instead, ANZUS was deliberately limited. The treaty committed its members to consult in the event of a threat and to act in accordance with their constitutional processes if attacked. This wording was carefully chosen by the Americans and fell well short of an automatic guarantee of military intervention. There were no integrated commands, no standing military headquarters, no permanent force allocations, no agreed plans for the defense of Southeast Asia, and no commitment by the United States to defend particular territories north of Australia. In many respects, ANZUS provided political reassurance rather than concrete military guarantees. Australian leaders continued to seek more extensive military cooperation after the treaty was signed. Rather than treating ANZUS as the final solution to Australia's security concerns, they viewed it as a foundation upon which stronger arrangements might eventually be built. This distinction became increasingly important during the 1950s. The Australians sought closer military planning with the United States and hoped that ANZUS could become the basis for a broader American commitment to Southeast Asia, particularly to the defence of Malaya and the wider region that Australian planners now regarded as vital to Australia's security. The Americans consistently resisted these efforts. American policymakers wanted flexibility and were weary of becoming tied to specific regional commitments that might limit their freedom of action. They preferred to retain the ability to decide where and when American forces would be used, rather than commit themselves in advance to defending particular areas. Australia found itself in a curious position. It had succeeded in obtaining an alliance with the world's most powerful nation, yet it still lacked the firm security guarantees that it had hoped to secure. The challenge of persuading the United States to support Australia's priorities became increasingly apparent after the creation of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organisation in 1954. The Australian government hoped the organisation might evolve into an Asian equivalent of NATO, a permanent military alliance that would bind the United States to the defence of Southeast Asia through a joint planning, allocated forces, and coordinated strategy. The origins of the organisation lay in growing concerns about communist expansion throughout Asia. The collapse of French resistance in Vietnam in 1954 raised fears that communist influence might spread throughout the region. The alliance brought together the United States, Britain, France, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, the Philippines, and Pakistan. Through a separate protocol, Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam were also brought within the treaty's sphere of concern. On paper, the arrangement appeared impressive. In practice, however, serious problems quickly emerged. The fundamental issue was that the members did not agree on what the organisation was supposed to do. Australia viewed the organisation primarily as a means of defending Southeast Asia. The United States viewed it differently. Washington saw the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization as a political instrument rather than a military alliance. American leaders wanted a framework that would provide diplomatic legitimacy for action against communist aggression, but they were reluctant to create the kind of integrated command structures that existed in NATO. The distinction was crucial and reflected deeper strategic differences. Australian planners remained focused on the defence of Malaya and the wider Southeast Asian region. American planners preferred a broader approach based upon naval power, air power, and strategic mobility. Rather than committing themselves to the defence of specific territories, they wanted the freedom to respond wherever they considered it necessary. To the Australian government's frustration, the alliance that was supposed to anchor American power in Southeast Asia remained largely a political organisation. The Australian government hoped that the Commonwealth Strategic Reserve in Malaya could form the military backbone of regional defence and eventually be linked to a broader American commitment to the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. The Americans disagreed. In 1955, the chairman of the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Arthur Radford, effectively dismissed many of the assumptions underpinning Australia's planning. The United States would not commit specific forces to the defence of Malaya. It would not subordinate its regional strategy to Commonwealth arrangements. It believed that Thailand and Indochina should receive greater attention than Malaya. By the mid-1950s, Australia found itself in a peculiar position. It belonged to three alliance structures, ANZUS and SEATO, yet none provided what the Australian government most desired, a firm American commitment to the defence of Southeast Asia, supported by detailed military planning and allocated forces. The result was a persistent tension that would shape Australian defence policy throughout the remainder of the decade. By the late 1950s, Australian policymakers had come to accept a difficult reality. The United States was not prepared to provide the level of commitment to Southeast Asia that Australia had hoped to secure through ANZUS and SEATO. Rather than abandoning its strategic objectives, Australia adapted. The Australian government continued to regard Southeast Asia as Australia's first line of defence and increasingly focused on what it could do itself. Australian forces remained committed to the Commonwealth Strategic Reserve in Malaya, giving Australia a permanent military presence in the region and a direct role in its security. At the same time, Australian defence planners reassessed the kind of conflicts they were likely to face. Rather than preparing primarily for a global war, they focused on limited conflicts and communist insurgencies in Southeast Asia. This thinking influenced Australia's 1956 strategic review, which emphasised mobility and the ability to respond rapidly to crisis throughout the region. The aim was to ensure that Australia could make a meaningful contribution to regional security, even if its allies proved unwilling to provide all the support Canberra desired. This was a significant step towards the distinctly Australian approach to regional security. So how independent was Australia's defence policy in the early Cold War? Australia was becoming increasingly independent, but not independent enough to stand alone, but not fully reliant on a single power, even if it wanted to be. The years after the fall of Singapore forced Australian leaders to think about security in a different way. Rather than simply accepting British or American priorities, they increasingly focused on what they believed mattered most to Australia, the security of Southeast Asia. At times, this brought Canberra into disagreement with Britain. At other times, it brought Australia into disagreement with the United States. Australia was deciding for itself what needed to be defended and where Australia's future security would be found.